Well, welcome everybody to the online program of the Sunshine Coast Health Center up here in Powell River, BC. And our programs are always on recovering from addiction. And we've been talking about one of the principles that seems to be necessary for living a meaningful life. As you may know, especially if you're an alumnus of this facility, that our therapy is, the starting point of our therapy is Viktor Frankl's idea that addiction is a response to living a life that lacks personal meaning, so that the solution becomes fairly obvious. Live a personally meaningful life. So then the trick becomes, well, how do you do that? And one of the principles that seems to be necessary for this is the idea of being true to yourself. To be true to what's actually important to you as a human being. And the idea comes from Shakespeare, right? To thine own self be true. And also picked up by Alcoholics Anonymous. Great fans of that concept of being true to yourself. Anyway, so we've been talking about this principle of being true to yourself, and one of the ways to understand it is by looking at people who are not true to themselves. Now, those of you who have had experience with addiction probably have some guilt over some of the things you did that went against your belief system. Perhaps you're a father, right? And you weren't there for your child's birthday because you were intoxicated. That's one example, right? So you have a value of it's important to be a good father, I love my child, yet somehow my behavior didn't match that value, right? So there's this conflict. But a really dramatic example of the conflict happened a few years ago with a very famous experiment in psychology called the Milgram Obedience Study, in which normal, everyday people volunteered for the study, and it was remarkable results because the way that Stanley Milgram, the experimenter, designed the study was that normal everyday people would actually inflict this unbelievable amount of pain on an innocent person. And they did it because they felt under pressure from this authority figure who was wearing a white coat, and he was a scientist, right? And that was really quite a remarkable experiment, because one of the things that we discovered from the experiment was how people were reacting, because they were doing things, they were inflicting this horrendous amounts of pain on these innocent people, and they were fighting with themselves, because they certainly didn't have an image of themselves as this nasty person who would do that, and they were doing it only because of this guy in the white coat kept telling them, well, it's for the experiment, you must continue on. And so this struggle that people had, and some people were sweating during this. They didn't want to inflict this pain, but they did because the scientists told them to. Other people seemed like they, in psychology we call it dissociate. They sort of blocked it out and just almost went through some kind of mechanical operation as if, yes, they were physically present, but really they weren't there. So they weren't paying attention to their own feelings and what was going on in the situation. And some people got very, very angry, but they continued on. And it was interesting, the reactions of the individuals to this pressure cooker situation that they were in, where the scientists kept telling them, for the good of the experiment, for the good of science, you must keep going on. And part of this experiment was to inflict this pain on people. But there's a good lesson that whenever people are in conflict with themselves, when they're not being true to what they believe about who they are as a person, what the world is like, and how they fit in the world, that this tremendous conflict rises up within them. And all sorts of bad things happen. But one of the key pieces is you can't be true to yourself. You can't be comfortable with yourself. You are, as we say in psychology, fragmented when you're not following your values. And so this is a very interesting thing, and it may be one of the key principles of living a meaningful life, that you actually have to pay attention to those things that are important to you as a person. And when you do that, people who, some very famous people who have done this, they seem to live contented lives. We can think of people like Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Malcolm X later on, after he became a pacifist, all sorts of people who were true to their belief system and who pursued that, rather than ended up into this profound conflict within themselves and did things that went against their values because of some external force. Anyway, it was a very interesting experiment and very instructive to understand what happens to people when they're not true to themselves, because they can't possibly live this meaningful life in which they feel fulfilled and energized and excited. At any rate, that's it for this program, and we'll be back next time with another topic.